Okay, we've got two more slides on work breakdown structures and then we're done. So the first is a WBS dictionary. This is a document that you really should have along with your work breakdown structure that defines each work breakdown structure item. So if we go back a little ways to the slide with the initial house construction work breakdown structure, each of these work packages, well, these here aren't even work packages because we would break them down even further, but when you get down to the granular level of having a work package that you can assign to a single point of contact to make sure it's done or not, those need to be defined. What does that mean? So for this example, foundation, define that. And not define the foundation of a house, but define the work that needs to be done so that when someone looks at this, they know exactly what that entails. Every item on your work breakdown structure needs to have some sort of definition in terms of what it is. I'm just scrolling back here to my slide so that everyone is on the same page. So when you say we're going to upgrade computers, or when that's an element on your WBS, when you say install routers, rebuild database, define that. What does that mean according to your project so that people know what the work involved is going to be. This picture, by the way, is just a clip art of a dictionary page. It has nothing to do with a WBS dictionary. Again, there's no correct way to make a WBS dictionary. There's an example on page 223, but you don't have to be that formal. As long as you're defining your terms so that everyone involved with the project is on the same page, then you're fine. So when people look at the work breakdown structure, they know what the various items really mean when they see them. And finally, work breakdown structure best practices. This is just a couple things to keep in mind. Every work package should appear only once. You shouldn't have things appear repeatedly on a work breakdown structure. And yes, if you go back a couple videos ago when I was going through examples, one of those example WBSs did have project management listed more than once. That was just to show that project management processes do take place throughout a work breakdown structure. Really, every work breakdown structure should be listing items that only appear once individually. Every WBS item is the responsibility of one person. That doesn't mean one person literally does that work package, but one person is responsible for getting it done so that you can talk to that person about whether that work is done or not. It's a good idea to involve the project team in creating the WBS, use a WBS dictionary, and make sure it's flexible and adaptable to change. If things are set in stone on your WBS and you don't allow any deviation from it, then you might run into problems as conditions change throughout your project. So now let's talk about validating scope. This is when the deliverables are formally accepted by the client or the customer. And you have to manage and control for scope creep throughout the project, but then you validate after the project is finished. So this is only something that happens at the very end of the project. When you hand off the whatever it is that you've made to the person who you're making it for, you make sure that what you delivered is what they expected. It's not something that you can really do throughout the life of a project. If you don't let scope creep, if you don't control for scope creep, then the project can get bigger and bigger. And when it comes time to validate scope, you might realize that we did a lot of work that they didn't want or that we shouldn't have done. So validating scope is really important because you need to make sure that at the end of the day, the work that was done on the project is the work that should have been done on a project. Validating scope is a formal process for asking, did we do what we say we were going to do? The scope is, here's what we're going to do. Then you do it, and then you validate it to make sure that you did it correctly. Regarding scope creep, there's a few interesting anecdotes on page 225 that show how scope can get a little out of control. Like Foxmeyer Drug, they kept adding new features. McDonald's, the scale of their project went from small to large to totally unmanageable. And you don't want to wait until the last stage at validating scope to find out that things have gone totally off the rails. So it's important to manage scope and keep things under control throughout the life of the project. And a good way to do that is making sure that the work breakdown structure is adhered to. And like I've said a few times in other areas of these videos, don't overthink this. Validating scope is something we do all the time. Someone says they're going to do something for you, you just check to make sure they did it right. One example here, you take your car in to get new brake pads and the mechanic calls you and says, we got to replace the rotors too, plus new tires, and it's going to cost you more. Well, now the scope has changed. And so when you pick up your car, you got to validate that scope. Look at the brake pads, look at the rotors, look at the tires. Did they do what they say they're going to do? You're validating the scope, and you do this all the time. When you finish an IT project, it's important to validate scope in the same way. Make sure you and your customers are all on the same page regarding the work that you did. Another example of managing project scope and validating scope comes from pages 226 and 227. The book talks about the MyKey transportation card in Australia, in Victoria, Australia. It rolled out in 2010, and it was supposed to simplify the process of using public transportation. But there's a lot of problems with it. It didn't work on trams. There were lots of different MyKey cards that could be used for different things. Not everything worked together. People were getting overcharged. Basically, the new system did not meet the user requirements. And as a result, when it came time to validate scope on the project, there was a lot of issues because things changed so much. It's still in use today. It's gotten better with time, but it's still problematic. So make sure that you have time in place for your project to validate scope so that when you are done with the project, your client knows that you did the work you say you were going to do and everyone agrees on this work. And if your scope has gotten out of control throughout the life of the project, there might be some issues when it comes time to validate the scope.